I think Roberto is trying to connect now.
Wonderful.
No, that's not him.
With Ramon Esteve, who is on the screen now.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking over.
Here now, Roberto is coming. Hi, Ramon.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Roberto.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Nice to be with you again.
Tell us when you're ready and then we can start.
Let me just get this stuff out of the way. Let me refocus here. So because the light outside. Okay, all set.
All right then. Welcome to our webinar entitled Multilateral Trade, Challenges, Opportunities, and Perspectives for Latin America. My name is Tatiana Gaspar. I'm the Managing Director of the Latin American Chamber of Commerce in Switzerland and your host today. Our guest speaker was the Director General of the World Trade Organization for 7 years, and as such left a significant and lasting footprint. He is widely considered to be one of the world's foremost experts on the issue of global trade. Under his leadership, the WTO expanded and introduced essential improvements to its services. In August 2020, he left the WTO to join one of the world's leading food and beverage companies, PepsiCo. We are extremely grateful and honored that he made time in his busy schedule to be with us today. A very warm welcome to our webinar, Roberto Azevêdo.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. And well, good evening in Geneva for everyone.
Our moderator is well known to our audience in Switzerland and across the Atlantic, as he has become a fixture on our webinar screens this year. He is also the honorary ambassador of our chamber. Always good to see you, and a warm welcome to you too, Dr. Philippe Nell.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very nice to be with you this afternoon.
Even in times of coronavirus, when events are not an option, our chamber relies on the kind support of our sponsors. I wish to thank our sponsor today, ECOM Agroindustrial Corp Limited, a leading Swiss-based commodity trading company, and particularly its board member, our chamber's president, Ramon Esteve, for generously supporting this webinar. Ramon was scheduled to address a few personal welcoming remarks, but was unfortunately prevented at the last minute. He sends his best regards, and I think he is with us in spirit, if not on camera. Before we start, I would like to make our audience aware that this webinar is recorded and that the recording will be posted on our website. We are, as always, reserving time for questions for our viewers. Please write them in the Q&A section. In case you worry about privacy, you may ask the question anonymously. Now I'm pleased to hand over to you, Philippe.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Let me also welcome you warmly, Dr. Azevêdo, at today's webinar of the Swiss Latin American Chamber of Commerce. We are very pleased to have you with us. The WTO celebrated last year its 25th anniversary. You have led the WTO, as Tatiana said, during the past 7 years. Some, I would say, of the most difficult years for the organization, which has been moving increasingly from a multilateral format to plurilateral ones, and also which has lacked a strong leadership as the United States turned increasingly into a strong critic. You have a deep knowledge of the importance of global trade for sustainable development and inclusive growth, as well as the difficulties to reform trade rules, further liberalize trade, and engage in new fields. Key issues have been on the table for a long time. Agreements have been difficult to reach with a large group of members defending positions based on fundamentally different political and economic interests. Presently, the situation is even more complex, with a 9.2% fall in world trade for 2020, just forecasted by the WTO. It is the sharpest fall in years, together with the 2008-09 financial crisis. I would like to propose that we start by making first an assessment of the multilateral trading system. Second, discuss today's major challenges. And finally, look at the perspectives for Latin America. So first, turning to the assessment, world trade has grown significantly over the past 40 years and has benefited from trade liberalization. Since 2012, however, trade doesn't grow any longer faster than GDP, and trade in services has overtaken goods in growth. How would you interpret these changes?
Yeah, well, I would say that there are at least two elements there. And I think the first one is probably the economic growth, the relationship between trade expansion and economic growth. They're very much linked together. There is a multiplier when economic growth is going up. Trade tends to grow faster than economic growth, but also the same happens when it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
when economic growth is slowing down or going downwards, really, then trade decelerates much faster. So trade is more sensitive normally, that's the situation. So, and of course, even though the global economy was still growing, by 2019 and at the end of 2019, it was already decelerating quite significantly. And growth, in fact, contracted at the last quarter of 2019, which was the first time that it contracted since the financial crisis in 2008. So I would say that is clearly one element. Another important element, I think, is the trade tensions, particularly between the US and China. And there, I would say there are two major components. One is the tariffs themselves. So tariffs were going up and trade restrictions were going up because precisely of the tensions between the two, and other countries got involved in one way or another. But also because these tensions introduced uncertainties in the market. And uncertainties tend to scare off investors.
Yes.
Investors retract, and when investments go down, trade goes down in a more accelerated fashion. A lot of the trade components are related to investments. So the moment that uncertainties are in the market, investors are not investing, trade then goes down. So I would say a combination of those two things, economic growth slowing down, and the trade tensions, I would say, are responsible for the big portion of the slowdown in trade that we have seen recently.
Yes, and finally, trade in commercial services could be the good news in all of that, because it is really growing faster than trade in merchandise trade in the past few years. And in your reports, the WTO, you have also shown very well the importance of value added and the importance also of value chains. And this all plays also with services.
That's exactly the same. That's exactly the same. And the two are not completely disconnected because when you have trade in goods, much of the trade in goods are associated with services as well. Yes. Either within the product itself has a component of services, for example, maintenance, other types of support that are given, or transportation, logistics, insurance, financing. There are a number of components of service that are also connected to the trading goods. So if one goes down, the other one is likely to go down as well. So it's not surprising that that we see that kind of correlation.
Yeah, and one big change we have witnessed now in the past few years is really digitalization. It has changed many aspects of our lives. Online markets have been created, and also business commercial services operations have grown significantly. How do you assess the impact of digitalization on trade?
Well, it's clearly one of the big drivers of the 21st century economy. And I would say, if I were looking at from a trade perspective, I think digitalization has both opportunities and risks. In terms of opportunities, clearly it promotes more competition. It facilitates the entry of new players in the marketplace. For example, small and medium enterprises, geographical distances are diminished. It's easier for them to participate in the platforms that we have available, so they can integrate themselves more in global trade flows. And all this, at the end of the day, by increasing competition, by increasing more suppliers, more choices, also at the end of the day, diminish costs, both of entry and for consumers. So the product at the shelf, with the digitalization phenomenon, they tend to go down because of this increased competition. Now, that's, I would say, some examples of the potential benefits that we can derive from digitalization. But there are also risks. One of the risks that I see is that we still don't have, at least from an international perspective, we still don't have uniform rules. The platforms each have their own rules. Protection of the consumers, each country has their own rules. Even the platforms themselves have different rules. We were hoping to get some degree of harmonization, for example, in the negotiations at the WTO that are now ongoing.
Yes.
But with a joint initiative on e-commerce, for example. Now,
yes,
that's one potentiality, that you harmonize these things and you offer predictability for the players. But if that doesn't come through, and if we continue not to have these, more international standards out there, there is a real risk of fragmentation. And it's not only the fragmentation, it's also because if you have the fragmentation of the internet spaces, what you may see is concentration in those spaces. So you have the big corporations, the big mega tech companies monopolizing those spaces, because competition will be much more difficult for the medium-sized and smaller-sized players if the internet is actually fragmented. So we do have to be mindful of these opportunities, but also of the risks if we don't do anything and just allow it to move without any kind of harmonizing effort.
Yeah, I fully share your views. We have a very big agenda in terms of digitalization, which also include the digital services tax, which is being discussed now at the OECD.
That's right.
Let me now come back to the US-China trade war, which you just referred to a few minutes ago. Last year, the US deficit toward China declined by $67 billion. Their trade declined by 17% for the US imports and exports with China. The average tariff was 20% on Chinese exports to the US and vice versa. So the data is there. But now something also which worries the business community and also other WTO members is the signification of this trade war for the world trade system, for the rules as they have been set up in the WTO by unilateral actions of one of the owner partner and then retaliation by the other. How do you see this in terms of the rules?
Well, I would say that, you know, the U.S.-China tensions is something that had very significant impact in global trade. That goes without saying. The Phase 1 agreement between the U.S. and China, it was welcome, I think, by the international community in general. And mind you, it was welcomed even by those who could be losing out because of the Phase 1 agreement. Because some of the arrangements that could happen between the US and China under Phase 1 could also shift trade away from other suppliers to the benefit of either the US or China, depending on what sector you are talking about. For example, China would give, presumably, preferential access to agricultural US exports to China under Phase 1. Now, other agricultural exporters could be harmed by that kind of preferential treatment that would be given to the US. I don't know how that would happen in practice and in detail, but even those who could potentially be affected, they were careful, they were, you know, conscious that this was not something without consequences, but in general, members of the WTO and other internet, you know, players, institutions, most people acknowledge that that was a step forward. Why? Because that could be an important move to a détente between the US and China in some way that could maybe plant the seeds of a modus vivendi between the two powers down the road, which would reduce uncertainties and would resume things to a normal pace, and then we would see more investments and the economy would grow again, et cetera, et cetera. Now, having said that, I would say it's early to tell whether that is or was going to really come to fruition. First, because we have a change in administration in the United States now. Second, because of COVID, the pandemic affected trade flows significantly between both sides. And I suppose it's difficult to tell today whether Phase 1 was actually working or not. Now, having said that, if the logic is between the two players is a logic of looking for a modus vivendi, like I said, looking for win-win scenarios, maybe rebalancing the conditions of trade between the two, but in a way that both benefit at the end of the day, I think that's okay. And I think that that's something that would give us reasons for optimism. However, if the logic is one tries to defeat the other, or one tries to superimpose its views on the other, then I am not so optimistic, because one will only accommodate so far. After a while, I think the domestic pressure of constituencies and politics begin to take over, and it's much more difficult. So, and those tensions are not going to disappear with the new administration, with the Biden administration, if it comes in. And I suppose we have to see how this is going to develop down the road.
No, we have been also on the Swiss side observing this. And when we look at the chapter on intellectual property, we must say that there are a number of measures that China is taking now, which is also being closely followed by the US, which are erga omnes, applied to the whole world community, and which are also favorable and are very favorable for us. For instance, on counterfeit and pirated goods, and also, for instance, on the extension of patents, to take into account the time it takes to approve a patent. But remaining on the role of the United States, as you know, for many years, the United States has played a key role, in particular on trade, to shape the world trade agenda. And now we are looking forward to President-elect Joe Biden. And he just said yesterday at a conference that the United States and its allies need to work together to set the rules of the road for global trade so that China is not dictating them. So are we looking toward a new era now with the United States, which should comfort your successor at the WTO?
Yeah, well, first of all, the U.S. re-engaging and trying to, in the WTO and in other trade negotiations, trying to seek for outcomes and show some degree of leadership is very important. It's very important because in trade negotiations in general and in trade policy, you usually need a core group coalescing around some ideas. Without that nucleus of common views on how to advance things, it's very difficult to irradiate those ideas and carry a negotiation that is successful with a large number of members, even at the multilateral scene with all of them, or even part of them. If you don't have key drivers, there are important players, there are important trade partners, it's very difficult to drive the negotiations forward. Now, so it's very important that the US comes back and re-engage, but I don't think it's sufficient in itself. I think it would need the US to have maybe a different approach, because there will be very divergent views in trade negotiations. There always are. How much will a new administration in the United States be willing to compose with China to try to seek common ground and solutions on issues that are extremely difficult? Especially differential treatment is one of them. State-owned enterprises is another one. You yourself mentioned intellectual property issues, which are a hot topic. Financing, subsidization. There are a number of very hot topics there for both sides, I suppose. And so it's not enough. And of course, like I said before, the tensions between the US and China are not going to disappear. They are going to continue. So we have to see under what kind of approach the new team of the United States is going to behave towards China and vice versa. So we have to see that. And another one that I think I said it's not enough to come back. I say it's not enough because I am not 100% sure that trade is at the top of the priorities of the new administration. Certainly not trade liberalization.
Yes.
I think that's not necessarily the mindset at this point in time. I think liberalization is important. I think they would do that, but not without a number of caveats. And how open, how much appetite there will be to engage in negotiations that liberalize trade in one way or another. I am not so sure what impetus we will see down the road. So it's welcome, the United States coming back, re-engaging at the welcome. But I think we need more data, more elements to decide whether that is going to be sufficient to unlock negotiations and progress in the multilateral trading system.
Yes, I think taking from the language from President-elect Joe Biden over the last few days, we can see that he wants to re-engage, in particular with the major allies, and then see how far we can go and what are the parameters that we can do. So at least it is a very good sign, in the way he looking toward a trade and also other U.S. engagement at the international level. Because you now turning to the challenges, really the challenges that we are facing at the world level, we talk a lot about reforms, and you hinted a little bit just a couple of seconds ago when you talked about special and differential treatments and non-market practices. There is also the dispute settlement appellate body. The trade rules face strong pressure for reforms in several areas. And where do you see yourself the key issues? And is there some room for maneuver, or do we still need more time in order to really assimilate all the parameters which are at play?
I think all the issues you mentioned are important, all of them. And I don't think that you can credibly make a whole lot of progress in the WTO if you don't tackle those. You may try, to do some things early on. I mean, there is a shift in the U.S. administration. There is a shift in the direction of the WTO as well. And my successor will have very difficult choices to make, like I did when I came in. When I came in, we were struggling, and the WTO has been struggling for a long time, but it was also struggling. And I had to make a few calls. And I think one of them was we needed results fast, and we needed results at the multilateral level. And at the time, the trade facilitation agreement was ongoing. It was very, very tough, but we thought, maybe this is something that is significant and is credible. Let's try to get that. We did, and then we spent 1 year trying to reanimate the Doha round. It was clear after that year that it was a no-go. We were growing further apart than before.
Yes.
And I was a Brazilian negotiator before that, so I know exactly where we were and in the direction that we were going. We basically had at that point in time an effort that was possibly a walking dead, and that was holding back everything else. So we spent a whole year trying to figure out how to advance the Doha round. We couldn't do that, but we decided to advance anyway on some other topics. And then we did, the elimination of export subsidies, and we had the expansion of the information technology agreement, and we did a lot of things that were pretty important as well for the system. Why am I saying that? Because in the WTO, there will be tough calls now. Do they try to get progress in these areas right away? And some are advanced. For example, e-commerce. I think e-commerce is quite advanced. Facilitation of investments, I think, is advanced enough. The joint initiatives are somewhat advanced. But areas like special and differential treatment, re-engineering all that, I think it's going to be a major, major, major challenge. If you can do it at all, that's another question, and we're not getting to that, but there are ways of fixing that without having to renegotiate the whole thing. Now, is that an effort that people want to get in? I'm not sure. I agree with you that the appellate body, for example, in the dispute settlement pillar is a priority. You cannot keep pushing it back. And I think the change in administration in the US, the change of negotiators in the US team is helpful because there are ways of doing it. It's not an impossible task. The question is the ambition. What do you want with the appellate body, right? Do you want to fix the appellate body and address some of the problems that people had been identifying, like, for example, more streamlined procedures, not taking too long to finish the procedures, or curbing a little bit the overreach argument. And, it's very contentious because some think there is overreach, others don't, but there are ways of handling those things. Those things I think are doable, and there are ways of addressing them. Others, I'm not so sure. For example, if the whole notion is let's get rid of the appellate body, let's keep only the panel phase, I think that's more complicated. I'm not sure that members are ready to go in that direction. Or do we go back to the GATT structure where it's voluntary, where a party can block a panel that is, open against himself or herself.
Yes.
So I think that is also a major ask. I'm not sure that that this is the ask. I'm just saying some things for the appellate body, some level of changes I think are doable in the short term and can be done quite expeditiously, to be honest with you. Others are out of reach. But these are calls that the new director general will have to make. You know, there are areas that are advancing and that can go to a successful conclusion, I hope, by the next ministerial conference in June of 2021. Others, maybe for later. And those are calls that will have to come from the new director general and the members, of course. This is, at the end of the day, it's always the members who make the call.
Yes. No, I think I agree with you on the appellate body. There is now 25 years, of experience of panels of appellate body decisions, and therefore there is significant reference to see, where something should be done and also how it could be done, because this is not an impossible path to do. And on the Swiss side, we very much hope that this can now be taken up, in particular with the new U.S. administration, and that some solutions can be found.
Absolutely, but it's important. It's important also that people understand that the problems and the complaints about the appellate body are not from the Trump administration only. It's very important because people tend to say, "Oh, okay, so now we have a change, everything's fine." No, the United States had been complaining about the appellate body for several years, way before Trump. In previous administrations, there were already complaints. They thought that the appellate body was not functioning properly. So what the Trump administration did was they upped the ante. So they adopted an approach that was very disruptive by not authorizing the replacement of the outgoing appellate body members, and at the end of the day, paralyzing the appellate body. But all I'm saying is it doesn't mean that because the Trump administration is leaving, that the new one is going to all of a sudden say, okay, let's go back to what we were before. I don't think that that's, it may happen. I don't think it's a legitimate expectation or a reasonable expectation.
Yes, and we have seen the WTO has been creative in the past few years with moving toward with variable geometry with various groups, plurilaterals, which have been established, sometimes with 50, 70, more than 90 members, and so on. We have seen the European Union has also variable geometry with various of its integration schemes. It's a different level, but it is also, you have a group with the Euro, and then you have a group with Schengen, also with outside members, and you have different also regime for Eastern European countries. So the WTO has also been moving with these plurilateral groups. Where do you see a future toward these joint initiatives of plurilateral agreements? Do you think it's really the way to go?
I absolutely think it's the way to go.
Okay.
I have no doubts about that. Look, the world changed significantly. Let's look at why we're here. Why are members now, trying to advance in formats that are, not multilateral? So, in general, you see about 80 members, around 80 members, some more, some a little bit less, which in most initiatives, we're talking about around 90% of global trade in those initiatives, but 10% is out. Why are we doing that? Why is that happening now? It's because the world changed significantly. The players are different. When these negotiations happened back in 1995, there were two things that were very clear. First, developing countries rarely participated as main players. I know that particularly in the Uruguay round, major developing countries, Brazil, India, they were very, very active, and they, at the end of the day, accepted, for example, the inclusion of intellectual property. There were a number of things. new there. But in most instances, they were still benefiting from special and differential treatment. It was very, basically, they had longer time for implementation. They have, remember in intellectual property, India had a long time to implement, to come on board, et cetera, et cetera. So those countries, at the end of the day, they had more flexibility to join in. Negotiations today are not necessarily in that way anymore. They are requesting these countries to make very significant contributions. All of a sudden, if you look at the results of the Uruguay round in tariffs, for example, you have, for example, countries like Brazil and India. China is a different thing. China came later. But like Brazil and India, they have an average bound tariff. So the tariff that has a ceiling bound at the WTO much higher than those of developed countries. And India, for example, has a big portion of their tariffs which are not even bound, they are unbound. So there are no commitments whatsoever. I don't think that you would have a negotiation today that the developed countries would accept this degree of difference. I understand, and I come from Brazil and I come from a developing country. I understand that it's not the same. You're not talking about equal partners, but that degree of difference, that's I don't think it's acceptable today. It's a reality. So it makes negotiations a lot more difficult. So it's also at the same time very difficult to imagine that negotiators would accept a one-size-fits-all approach. So that negotiations, the outcome of the negotiations apply harmoniously to everybody, and that they have a very high level of ambition. It's just not doable, I don't think, politically for many players. So you have to be more flexible. You have to be, for example, those who can do and want to do and harmonize on electronic commerce and other peripheral, areas related to that. Then they go and do it. Those who cannot and who do not want to do that, stay out. Because if what you cannot do is reduce the level of ambition so much that it becomes irrelevant. It's irrelevant then as an outcome. So if you want to have a reasonable level of ambition, I think you need to have players and participants who are willing to go in that direction. Those who don't want to come, don't come. They will come later, or they don't come at all. But I think it's the only way to go. If you expect a multilateral negotiation that reduces those disparities that were inherited from the Uruguay round, in both ways, in some ways because developing countries had higher protection, for example, in industrial tariffs, etc. But the other way around too, in agriculture, many developed countries had a high degree of protection of their, agricultural markets, a large space for subsidization that today would not be acceptable. I don't think that the developing countries would accept an outcome like that anyway. So those things are very hard to square without a big deal. And that big deal, I don't see it happening, especially in the world that we live today, with all these geopolitical tensions, with all these economic restructuring. We are seeing structural changes in the global economy, in the national economies, with new technologies disrupting the labor force significantly. I don't see that grandiose deal happening in the near term.
Okay, thank you. No, I think, thank you very much. I think it's a very good synthesis you draw here of really how can we now move forward. And this is going to be through plurilaterals, and the ones who want to join later, they can always join later. But this will enable the organization to come up with some results in areas which are important for the members in the coming years. Now, let me turn to Latin America. Looking at Switzerland, for instance, only 2.1% of our exports go to Latin America, only 2.1%. On the import side, it is not much more if we take out gold, which is imported here for refining and then re-exported abroad. So for us, for instance, Latin America punches below its weight in trade. And how do you assess Latin America's position in world trade? What structural reforms should Latin America implement to benefit more from world trade? How do you see Latin America? You having represented Brazil for several years.
Well, the first thing, if you come from the region, like I do, you know that Latin America is very diverse.
Yes.
It's not uniform. You know, you can see, those in Europe can see the differences in Europe, from Greece to Italy, to Spain, to Germany, to France, to Sweden. They're very different. Latin America, even more so, much more so. So it's difficult to talk at Latin America as a single, uniform block of countries. It varies. It varies from area to area. I think in general, for example, in negotiations in the WTO, important segments of Latin America, important players in Latin America have contributed significantly to negotiations in the WTO, because they do want outcomes. And when I was the negotiator for Brazil, I can't say that I was not tough. I was tough, but I wanted an outcome. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why I was selected subsequently to be Director General. It's because the people I negotiated against, and they were surprised when I got support from somebody else, etc. They were saying, "Oh, but you were so tough with them, etc." And I said, "Well, I was tough with you too." And they said, "Yeah, but we knew that you wanted an outcome. You were trying to get something going that could work for everyone." And I think in Latin America, a big chunk of Latin America has that same spirit. They want to have a solution. They cannot have any outcome because they have their own, limitations, and they have their own red lines, like everybody else does. But they do want to improve. They do want the system. They all believe in the system, and they all want to have a system that functions. And I think that kind of spirit is there, but they're different. So the limitations are different. In Latin America, you have, for example, the bigger markets. If you look at Brazil and Argentina, over the years, I'm not talking about today's, government or anything, but over the years, they were more protective of their markets than others were. Chile was more open. Uruguay, Paraguay, the smaller economies, they were much more open than the bigger economies. Yes. Maybe because of their markets. They were small markets. They needed big markets to export to. The domestic market was not enough, so the medium-sized and low and smaller-sized economies were more open. And you could see that, for example, in the Pacific Alliance, and it was much more open. And you had the other extreme. So you had the other extreme with countries that had a completely different approach to trade, and their economic models were different. So if you look at Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, etc., that's a different kind of environment altogether towards trade and economic integration. So they're very different in what they do. But I think that in Latin America, in general, you see a group of countries that want to improve the system, that want to have the system going, and that also have the technical ability to contribute, because it's not only about willing to participate and willing to have a strong system. You have to be constructive. You have to be in a position to put proposals on the table, and put proposals that are technically solid, proposals that can help the negotiations move along. And in Latin America, you have many players who can do that. Even in Central America, Costa Rica is always very, very active. And the CARICOM countries are active too. They try to help. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, they all contribute in one way or another. Panama. And I think they are important players for the system. But regarding trade, it's a bit, some are ready to go further, others not so much. It varies from country to country.
Yes, yes. I can fully follow that. I'm going to ask Tatiana now if there are some questions which came from the audience.
Yes, indeed. We have a question from Kleber Porto Bank. Dr. Azevêdo, how do you see the current Brazilian foreign policies, especially regarding to Brazilian economical interests? Do you see progress anyhow over the last 2 years? What would you recommend as policy for Brazil from your standpoint? Thank you.
Well, as far as economic policy is concerned, I think this government, today's government, has a much more open view towards international integration than previous governments. But Brazil is a very complex country, and the more you know it, the more you are aware of those things. So opening up in Brazil is not, for example, lowering tariffs and improving and making it easier to get imports coming in. It's politically challenging because the country has been at this level of protection of the market for, I don't know, maybe the last 50 years.
Yes.
So it's difficult to change because lobbies, exist, and so companies who are used to have this kind of protection to play in the domestic market, they complain when the government talks about opening up the market, and they complain, and some of the complaints are quite legitimate. So the cost of doing business in Brazil is very high, and the government can help to lower the costs of doing business. Some things have changed for the better. So one complaint was the cost of capital. Well, today the cost of capital in Brazil is one of the lowest that it has ever seen in history. People complained about the exchange rate. The exchange rate today is very favorable for the Brazilian businesses as well. So some things are favorable, other things not so much. So for example, right now, because of the pandemics and everything, the recession in Brazil, there is unemployment, it's a difficult moment economically to say, on top of all that, I'm going to add a shock of, a trade-related shock or something like. It's tough. I think the economic notion is a good one. It is to open up, is to improve competitiveness, is to integrate Brazil more in international global trade flows and things like that. Now, the execution of those ideas is tricky because of all the things that I just said. Cultural, the circumstantial situation is not easy, but the vision, I think, is different, is from previous governments, and is more open, and I think that's a healthy development.
I think also, if my recollection is correct, some years ago, Brazil still had a large share of the economy in state hands. And this was a big shift and big effort they did to privatize and to put this into private hands. So this has already been a very significant move which has been done. And now the next stage must also follow, and will follow step by step. Okay, Tatiana, we may take another question, please.
Yes, we have one from Professor Lourdes Casanova. How do you see Chinese investments going forward in Brazil and Latin America?
Well, I think China will become inevitably one of the largest investors in the world, in developing countries for sure, because they, in many ways, complement the type of economic shortfalls on both sides. For example, in the food area, for example, China needs food. And China has a population of about 1.3 billion people. Their agriculture is robust, but not enough, I would say. And they need to ensure, sources of predictable and affordable, food. And investments in this area are going to be there, are going to be happening. I know it's happening in South America. I know it's happening in Africa. And for that to happen, they need other types of investments happening in infrastructure, for example, updating ports, roads, stockage facilities, stockpiling facilities, and things like that. So investments are going to be there. China is also trying to be a player in high technology areas as well. Telecommunications is one of them, and we see all the tensions that are out there in terms of telecommunications, but also trade, e-trade platforms and things like that. So there will be investments. I think China is clearly testing how to improve its connections globally. And investments is going to be a big part of that. So I think it's going to happen. It's going to continue for the time being.
Now, China is very active also for the Tren Bioceanico, a big project to link southern Brazil with southern Peru with a train. It's a project of about $20–25 billion, and China has offered to the countries, Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, to build it and also to finance it. It has not happened this far, but it shows how China is extremely, extremely active and ready to move forward on very important projects.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Tatiana, have we got another question?
No, we don't have any more questions here at the moment.
Okay. In that case, perhaps we could still add a few points in our discussion on one element which always interests me very much too, looking at world trade, looking at WTO, is the importance that free trade zone, regional trade agreements, as we call them, has taken over the past years. And we know it's an important complement. We know that it was already foreseen in GATT in 1947. You should allow countries which want to go faster than the group to do it. And this is the objective anyhow of the group, to have then at one time the largest liberalization possible, if not a full liberalization. But what do you think about the fact that now these regional trade agreements have taken such a dimension that Article 24 of GATT was seen like an exception to the most favored nation clause, and now it's becoming not anymore an exception, but more like the rule. So how do you see that in terms of a system, and also in terms of the benefits that these agreements have been bringing to their members and to world trade?
I think this is actually a welcome phenomenon. I think this kind of integration at the regional level is a welcome development. They are, in my view, building blocks that at the end of the day can inspire broader negotiations, even at the multilateral level. I think there are at least two things that are worth noticing. The first one is the fact that a lot of these negotiations are happening because we could not finalize agreements at the WTO. That's the reality. So they were trying to, advance whatever they could. Now, what I had been saying, and it's still valid, is trade negotiations are not easy, because if they're not happening in the WTO, it doesn't mean that automatically they're going to happen somewhere else. Because it was not only about the size of the WTO and how many members you had around the negotiating table. It was also about the different views that they had about what needed to be achieved. And well, we know how these things are. They're very political. They're very sensitive. I don't know how long we've been talking about an agreement between the European Union and the United States. Mm-hmm. Still hasn't happened. Yeah. Brexit. Yeah. Everybody thought that it was going to happen very quickly. Mm-hmm. The rules are the same, basically. The tariffs are the same. You don't even have to renegotiate the tariffs. But we see how difficult it is and how long it's taking, because politics get in the way. These things are very political. It's not only about a spreadsheet with tariff lines. Each tariff line has a name and a last name in them. And internally, those things add up. So it's a difficult undertaking there. But I think the fact that nonetheless, we saw many of those taking place and advancing, even if they were not of fantastic ambition, it was positive in the sense that you inspire, more negotiations to liberalize trade. So that in itself is positive, despite the difficulties. The second element that I think is important is the fact that some of these negotiations were now dealing with much more than just free trade, traditional. So it's not only about tariffs. They were negotiating rules in many areas. The last one, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which the US walked out when it was signed, when the administration shift happened in the US. It was dealing with very advanced, I think, disciplines for intellectual property.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Even now, even labor, environmental issues, all those things are coming in play. So these more advanced kind of disciplines that are not necessarily connected to tariffs only, this is another development, because if you can begin to get these disciplines agreed regionally, it, I think, makes it easier if you want to negotiate them at a more, multilateral or plurilateral level in the WTO, for example, because you have the basis there. A lot of these joint initiatives that you see in the WTO, if you look at the proposals that are on the table, a lot of those proposals are ipsis literis provisions that were already negotiated in regional agreements. So they're just bringing it there. And what you may see is a harmonization of those disciplines at the WTO level, for example. And that's a very helpful development, I think. Let's hope that this continues to go in the right direction.
Okay, so I think, Dr. Azevêdo, you have a commitment starting in a few minutes. We had a great discussion. I would like to thank you very much, because I think after 1 hour discussion, you were able to show us with much more clarity where the WTO stands, what are the issues, and also that there are many things to be done, and there are many things that are on the way. And therefore that the WTO has a great future, because there are new areas, and there are also quite a number of policies which can bring further forward world trade, and also enable the members to strengthen their ties. So we see that there is a lot that has been done this far. There is still a lot to be done, and that with the new US administration, we can have the expectation that indeed the climate as such will be different, and therefore will go toward a constructive approach, looking toward making progress in all the areas where that's going to be possible. So on my side, I would like to thank you very, very much for sharing with us your views this afternoon. And I will give now back the floor to Tatiana.
Now unmute. Also from my side, thank you very much, Roberto Azevêdo, for your outspoken and enlightening statements and your profound analysis, which helped us understand what global trade is all about with all its challenges. I'm sure we will follow the future developments on that front with great interest. And of course, we wish you the best of luck in your private sector career. And many thanks to Philippe for preparing and moderating this webinar with the usual expert guidance. Some viewers may not be aware that you recently published a book on trade entitled Strategy with China, Swiss Cooperation or US Confrontation, the Successful Swiss Path with the Free Trade Agreement. I quickly want to show it. Don't know No, it's not really very well visible, but more details on the book and a link to download can be found on our website in the news section. I also want to thank once again our sponsor, ECOM Agroindustrial Corp Limited, in particular Ramon Esteve, president of our chamber, for supporting this webinar very generously. So dear viewers, we have one more webinar planned for you in 2020, precisely on December 8th. The guest speaker will be a power lady, Professor Lourdes Casanova from Cornell University. We will disclose further details to you very shortly. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay safe and goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Philippe.
you.
Tatiana.
Bye.
Bye, Roberto.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.